In this video, we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, we're going to talk about the Sumy direction, where, according to pro-Russian resources, the armed forces of the Russian Federation continue their offensive operation. But when talking about the situation on the ground, we still have no changes. Probably we haven't received any changes since the beginning of probably June of 2025. So the Russians, according to changes on the ground, the Russian offensive stopped approximately 2-3 weeks ago, but according to pro-Russian sources, they continue their offensive. So the situation remains tense and very difficult, and during the previous 12 hours, we got another video where we can see lots of episodes how the Russians were bombing and attacking positions of the armed forces of Ukraine along Russian positions in the northern part of the Sumy region. Lots of attacks, lots of explosions, but without changes. And some sources from pro-Ukrainian side published very interesting article about the situation. The Ukrainians are saying that maybe the Russians are not going to move further in the southern direction because the Russians managed to achieve everything they were tasked for. And the main task of the Russians was to establish complete artillery fire control over the city of Sumy itself. The Ukrainians are saying that on the 22nd and on the 23rd of June, the Russian army launched an artillery strike on the village of Pishane, which is less than a kilometer from the border of the city of Sumy. So the Russians began bombing and attacking, so the Russian artillery can attack the city of Pishane, which is already an outskirts and the suburbs of the city of Sumy itself. So the distance is very huge, and according to these data, currently the Russians, as a result of their offensive operation, managed to establish complete artillery control over something like this. Maybe this is enough for the Russians for this stage of offensive operation. Maybe the Russians are still waiting for North Korean engineers. Maybe the Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation, and the Russians understand that they have no chances to continue moving further in the southern direction, and they need to think before moving further. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction. During the previous 12 hours, we got lots of very interesting updates. According to information we have, the Ukrainians launched counter-offensive operation in this area along N20 road with the purpose to unblock the Ukrainian forces that were caught by the Russians in the area of Katerinovka and Kliban-Byk. The Ukrainians were trying to counter-attack in this area with the purpose to restore control over the southern part of Alexandra Kalinova. We still haven't received anything regarding the results of Ukraine counterattack, but the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation published this video where we can see how Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainians along the entire Alexandra Kalinova and the eastern part of the village of Yablunovka, and we believe that any attempt from the Ukrainian side to counterattack in this area failed. The Russians managed to repel everything, and now the Russians are getting ready before the beginning of another wave of offensive operation with the purpose to improve their position significantly in the village of Alexandra Kalinova and in the eastern part of the settlement of Yablunovka. The Ukrainians are saying that the situation is very difficult in this area, and something tells me that maybe this week is going to be a turning point in the battle for the southern part of the Kliban-Byk reserve. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation about the most important direction. We are talking about the Pokrovsk agglomeration and more precisely about the settlement of Novoekonomichne. So this is a focal point of the Russian offensive operation that they are trying to carry out right now. So there are very heavy clashes in this area, and both the Russians and the Ukrainians understand the value of the settlement, and if the Russians are able to take this settlement under complete control, this is going to be already the end of the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration. And everything after that comes after from the fall of Novoekonomichne is going to be just an agony of Ukrainian contingent on the territory of this agglomeration. And according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians once again managed to improve their position significantly. And when talking about this area, probably starting from the beginning of the previous week, several pro-Russian resources almost every single day published additional update about additional progress on the ground. And right 1 week after, so on the beginning of this week, several neutral mappers summarized everything that took place in this area, that have taken place in this area since the beginning of the previous week, and now we can see and understand more or less reliable picture. So the Russians launched several attacks, several waves of attacks in many directions, trying to attack the Novoekonomichne settlement from many sides. One of the attacks took place in the southern direction, and according to information we have, the Russians managed to secure this stronghold, this small stronghold, and the Russians managed to establish complete control over this tree line. So when summarizing everything from this direction, we see that the Russians most likely are planning to maintain their line to shorten the distance and to establish complete control over this small part. For these purposes, they need to secure additional stronghold, this one, and this, let's say, dense network of the fortifications. This will allow the Russians to shorten the distance to the Novoekonomichne, the city, from the south, and to the settlement of Mirnograd from the east. Furthermore, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the west of the village of Mirne and to take under complete control a stronghold to the east of this village of Novoekonomichne. We're talking about this territory. So the Russians managed to break through, as you can see, according to different mappers, and to secure this territory. This is very important progress on the ground, because now Ukrainians have no chances to control and to save their positions in this pocket, because from these positions along N32 road, the Russians can control everything inside of this pocket, which means that most likely today or this upcoming night, Ukrainians will finish their evacuation from this pocket towards the village of Nikolaevka, and this will allow the Russians to shorten the distances and to maintain the lines like this. So this will allow them to outflank and to semi-encircle the Novoekonomichne small agglomeration from the south, from the southeast, and from the east. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians improved their positions in the fields in the eastern and the northeastern directions. The Russians, according to information we have, took under control this dense network of the fortifications, and the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to take under control several tree lines and fields in the direction of the northeastern part of the settlement. Furthermore, I would like to remind you that several mappers reported that first sabotage and reconnaissance group of the armed forces of the Russian Federation were able to answer the village of Novoekonomichne from the northeast during the previous week. So there were several episodes when the Russians most likely answered the settlement, but then the Russians retreat back towards more reliable positions. So the Russians have possibilities currently to answer Novoekonomichne, as I understand the Ukrainians don't have full control over the settlement. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians answered and took under control dense network of the fortifications to the southwest of the settlement of Novotaretsk. So this is also very important progress. The Russians managed to establish control over this territory. If this information is correct, then we understand that this is already the beginning of the battle for the settlement of Novotaretsk itself. But I would like to remind you that yesterday several pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians already answered both the settlement of Novoekonomichne, the settlement of Razina, and the northeastern part of the settlement of Novotaretsk. And we are waiting for additional details, of course, for additional updates. So we need to understand that currently this is the area of the most fierce clashes, probably since the beginning of the special military operation. Nobody talks a lot about this, neither the Ukrainian Minister of Defense nor the Russian Minister of Defense, because everybody understands that this is the most important battle of the, let's say, 2025 military campaign. Because if Russians can take this territory under complete control, and we are talking about everything that is located to the south and to the east of this red line, once again, this is going to the beginning of the agony for the contingent of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Pokrovsk agglomeration. The Russians understand this, the Ukrainians understand this, and nobody count losses with the purpose either to establish control over this territory or to hold these territories for as long as possible. With the Russian offensive operation from the east in the direction of the Pokrovsk agglomeration, the Russians launched their offensive operation from the south. And according to several mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the village of Zverova, and the Russians managed to improve their positions along the railways to the south of the city of Pokrovsk, including improvements of positions in the villages of Novoukrainka and Chinshine. So by the morning of 30th of June of 2025, the Russians most likely established control over something like this. And according to this configuration, we believe that currently the most fierce battles and clashes are taken for this butterfly stronghold along M30 road. And the Russians are trying to take this territory. This will allow to maintain the lines and to shorten the distances to the city of Pokrovsk itself from the south. Similar picture we can see in the vicinity of the settlement of Novo-Nikolaevka. Today Russian sources published this video where we can see how a Russian soldier raised the Russian flag in the most northern part of the settlement of Novosergeyevka. Based on this video we haven't adjusted anything because several days or weeks ago the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmed that the settlement of Novosergeyevka was already taken and secured by the Russians, and we adjusted the map of this village once again several weeks ago, but today we got the video from the most northern part. So most likely when the Russians reported about control of the settlement by the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we believe that the Russians control just 80% without the most northern part. And now we see that the Russians secured the settlement completely. And this is very important because now the Russians have possibilities to attack the butterfly stronghold also to the north of the settlement. I would like to remind you that during the previous days the Russians began advancing from Novosergeyevka in the direction of the settlements of Molodetska and Udachная, but the Russians couldn't move further in the northern direction because this butterfly stronghold was a main problem and main barrier for this. And now the Russians, as we understand, decided to maintain their lines and to establish complete control over this territory. This will allow the Russians to move further in the northern direction without any barriers and without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. As for the South Donetsk direction, according to several mappers, the Russians secured additional tree lines in the pockets between the settlements of Goryokhova, Alexeyevka, Zelenokut, Dachная. So we understand that the Ukrainians are finishing the battle for this pocket is about to be finished. The Ukrainians during obviously this week will abandon their positions completely. When talking about the South Donetsk direction, currently the Russians launched another major offensive operation with the purpose to develop their movements in the northwestern direction from the village of Velika Novoselka. So there are very heavy clashes for this territory, and the Russians are tasked to establish complete control over the settlements like Podubная, Mirная, Voskresenka, Alexandragrad, Yaranskaya, Maliivka, and so on. And currently the main clashes are taking place for the villages of Maliivka and the settlement of Voskresenka. The Russians are attacking these two villages from the east and from the southeast. So soon we start receiving first updates exactly from this territory. The Russians chose this direction as a primary attack due to the village of Velika Mikhailovka. This is the settlement we are talking about. The Russians chose this option because, as we discussed in the previous videos, there are lots of no-name villages in this area, and it is very difficult to advance from one village to another because the Russians, if they take another village under control, they will have less and less chances to concentrate additional forces. So to move further, the Russians need some areas where they are able to concentrate huge masses. So Velika Mikhailovka and the settlement of Aristopol could be a very good villages where the Russians will be able to concentrate additional forces to continue offensive operation further in the western and the northwestern directions. And the distance to these small villages, to this small agglomeration of villages, is very short. So the Russians will be able to get there within a month.
Okay venner, så 3 har altså sendt mig, Kasper og Mie afsted på en tur til Costa Rica. For de har nemlig udvidet.
As for the Zaporozhye direction, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the area of Kamenskaya. The Ukrainians managed to introduce additional forces in this area with the purpose to stabilize the situation, but we believe that Ukrainians lost momentum. The Russians, at the same time, Russian offensive operation is gaining momentum currently. The Ukrainians are trying to stabilize the situation in the northern part, but the sources are saying that the village of Kamenskaya either under complete Russian control or, let's say, some part is in the gray zone. So there are no more Ukrainian strong positions in this area. The Ukrainians are trying to bring forces to the northern part, but for example in this video we can see how Russian helicopters were bombing and attacking this territory. Furthermore, we have another very important video from the central part of the settlement of Kamenskaya. The Russian soldier established the Russian flag along the bridge between the southern and the northern part, and he did this without any problems from the Ukrainian side, which means once again again that most of the village of Kamenskaya is already under complete Russian control, and the northern part is in the gray zone. We expect that during this week the Russians will secure this territory completely, and the battle for Plamny is going to start. As we discussed in the previous videos, the most important task for the Russians is to establish complete FPV drone control over the railways that go from the city of Zaporozhye further in the eastern direction. The Russians want to cut and to probably weaken the Ukrainian logistic. Furthermore, during the previous nights, the Russians carried out another massive missile and drone strike all over the entire territory of Ukraine. Mainly the Russians were using drones. In this video, we can see an explosion in the area of the city of Kryvyi Rog. Furthermore, the Russians during the previous night attacked the city of Odessa with a significant number of drones. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were trying to bring down Russian drones with air defense systems. So we need to understand that currently this is something like a reconnaissance operation from the Russian side, and most likely the Russians are going to repeat their massive drone and missile strike during the upcoming night after they finish this reconnaissance operation. During the day, during the 30th of June, the Russians will try to discover as many as possible Ukraine air defense systems, and then the Russians will attack everything with missiles. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes on my page.